Go home, kid. 2 words, flat, dismissive, delivered the way someone swats a fly, without looking up, without breaking stride, without any recognition that the person they were aimed at was a person at all. The man who said them was called Randall Pruitt. He was 53 years old, the president of the Hargrove Park Chess Association, and he had been running the Saturday afternoon tables in that park for 11 years. He wore a pressed linen shirt the color of old cream, a gold watch on his left wrist, and the particular expression of a man who has never once been told he was wrong about anything that mattered to him. He stood at the center of the concrete pavilion where 8 chess tables were bolted to the ground in 2 neat rows, and he said those 2 words to a 14-year-old boy who was sitting at table 7, quietly arranging pieces. The boy did not move. Randall said it again, louder this time so the other players could hear. This section is for members. Members only. We don't just let anyone sit down here. A man at table 3 looked up from his game. A woman near the pavilion's edge turned her head. Nobody said a word. "You hear me?" Randall said, and now he was standing directly over the boy, his shadow falling across the board. "Go home, kid. This isn't for you." The boy looked up once, briefly. Then he looked back down at the board. "Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason." What Randall Pruitt did not know, standing there in his linen shirt with his gold watch catching the afternoon light, was who he had just told to go home. He did not know what that boy had already done, what he had already built in the quiet hours before anyone was watching. He did not know that within 14 months, that same boy would sit across from the reigning state chess champion of Illinois and defeat him without once looking at the board. When the truth came out, it cost Randall Pruitt everything he thought the park had given him. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who that boy really was. His name was Darius Cole. He was 14 years old and he lived on the west side of Chicago in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Pulaski Avenue, where the radiator knocked every morning at 5 a.m. and the hallway always smelled of someone else's cooking. His mother, Evelyn Cole, worked the early shift at a hospital laundry facility 6 days a week. She left before the sun came up. She came home with her hands red and her feet swollen, and she still managed, most evenings, to sit at the kitchen table and ask Darius how his day had gone. She was the kind of woman who made something from nothing so quietly that you almost didn't notice the effort. Almost. Darius's grandfather, a man named Walter Cole, had lived with them for the last 4 years. Walter was 71, a retired postal worker who had grown up in Mississippi and carried that upbringing in the careful economy of his words. He had a chess set that he kept in a wooden box under his bed, a set he'd bought second-hand in 1974 from a pawn shop on the south side. The pieces were mismatched. The black queen was slightly taller than she should have been. The white rook on the king side had a chip along its base. Walter had never bothered replacing them. He taught Darius the game when Darius was 6 years old, sitting on the floor of the apartment with the board between them on a flattened grocery bag. "You're going to want to show people what you can do," Walter told him that first afternoon, moving a pawn to the center of the board with one deliberate finger. "Every time, you're going to want them to see it. Don't." He tapped the table once. "Stay low, build high. The board will speak for itself when it's time." Darius had not fully understood that then. He understood it now. Now, here's what most people didn't know about Darius Cole. He had been playing competitive chess since he was 8 years old. He had entered his first tournament, a regional junior bracket held in a church basement in Englewood, with his grandfather's mismatched pieces in a canvas bag and a composition notebook in which he had hand-copied 64 annotated games from a library book. He had won that tournament. He had won the next 3. By the time he was 11, he had a USCF rating that placed him in the top 12% of junior players in the state of Illinois. By 12, the top 6. By 13, he had played and beaten players twice his age and rated games at 3 different clubs across the city. He did not talk about this, not at school, not to the other kids on his block. He moved quietly through the world the way his grandfather had taught him. Head down, work done, results accumulated in silence. His rating climbed. His game deepened. He studied openings in the mornings before his mother left for work, end game theory at night with a flashlight when the apartment went dark. He had started coming to Hargrove Park on Saturday afternoon 6 weeks before Randall Pruitt told him to go home. He came because the park had the only outdoor chess tables in the neighborhood, and because he liked the sound of the pieces on stone, and because his grandfather had told him once that you learn things about a game by watching strangers play it that you can't learn from any book. He had sat at table 7 at the far end of the pavilion and played quietly against whoever sat across from him. He had won every game. He had not announced this. He had simply packed up his pieces when he was done and walked home. Nobody at the pavilion had asked his name. Nobody had asked his rating. Randall Pruitt had not asked anything. And that was the thing about Randall Pruitt. He was not a man who asked. He was a man who assessed. Quickly, confidently, and almost always wrong in the ways that mattered most. He had run the Hargrove Park Chess Association since its founding 11 years ago, and in that time he had shaped it into something that reflected his own image, orderly, credentialed, and quietly exclusive. Membership required a $75 annual fee, a sponsorship from an existing member, and attendance at what Randall called an orientation session, which was, in practice, a 2-hour meeting in which Randall explained the rules he had written and the standards he had set and the history he had decided the association had. He was not a bad chess player. He was, in fact, a competent one, a Class B player by USCF standards, which meant he was better than most casual players and considerably worse than anyone who had studied the game seriously past the age of 16. He had a rating of 1620, which he mentioned often. He had a framed photograph on the wall of his home office showing him shaking hands with the local alderman at a Park District event. He had the bearing of a man who had mistaken administration for mastery. The association's membership was, by any honest accounting, nearly all white. This was not a written policy. It was simply the result of who Randall invited, who he made feel welcome, and who he told, in so many words, to go home. Darius had first appeared at the pavilion on a Saturday in late September. Randall had noticed him immediately, a young black kid in a worn jacket, sitting down at table 7 without asking, pulling pieces from a canvas bag. Randall had watched him for a few minutes from across the pavilion. He had not approached. He had told himself he was giving the boy a chance to play a game and leave on his own. When Darius came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, Randall's patience, which was not patience at all, but the slow accumulation of a decision already made, ran out. The Saturday he finally approached, Darius had been sitting at table 7 for 20 minutes, mid-game against an older man named Gerald Fitch, who was one of the association's longer-tenured members. Gerald was a decent player, a Class C, and he had been losing steadily for the last 8 moves without quite understanding why. He was leaning forward over the board, studying it with the focused confusion of a man who can see the problem but not the shape of it. Randall walked up behind Darius and said it. "Go home, kid." Gerald looked up from the board. His expression shifted, something moving across his face that was not quite discomfort and not quite protest, but lived in the space between them. He said nothing. He looked back at the board. The other players at the pavilion had gone quiet. A man at table 2 set his piece down without completing the move. A woman who had been watching a game at table 5 took a small step backward, as though distance might insulate her from what was happening. Randall said it again, louder. "Members only. Not for you." Darius looked up at him once. His hands were resting flat on the table, on either side of the board. His face was still, not angry, not afraid. Still, the way deep water is still, not because nothing is moving beneath it, but because the surface has learned not to show it. He said quietly, "I'm in the middle of a game." 4 words. That was all. Randall's jaw tightened. "I don't care what you're in the middle of. This is a private association. You're not a member. You need to leave." A young woman named Priya Mehta was sitting at the bench nearest the pavilion entrance, waiting for her boyfriend to finish a game. She was not a member. She was not a chess player. She was simply someone who had been watching for the last several minutes with her hands pressed together in her lap, and what she saw in Darius's face in that moment was something she would describe later, to several people, as the most dignified thing she had ever witnessed in a public space. A 14-year-old boy being told he did not belong, sitting perfectly still, making no argument, surrendering nothing. Darius began, slowly and deliberately, to collect his pieces. He placed each one back into the canvas bag with the same care he always used. The pawns first, then the minor pieces, then the rooks, then the queen, then the king. He folded the small cloth board. He zipped the bag. He stood. He did not look at Randall Pruitt again. He walked out of the pavilion and into the afternoon light, and the park closed behind him the way parks do, indifferently, without record, as though nothing had happened at all. But something had happened, and it was about to have consequences that Randall Pruitt could not yet imagine. Now, here's what Gerald Fitch did after Darius left. Gerald sat at table 7 for a long moment after the boy was gone. He looked at the board. The position Darius had left behind was still arranged as it had been at the moment of interruption. 8 moves from a forced checkmate that Gerald had not yet seen. Gerald stared at it. He traced the lines of attack with his eyes, following the logic of what Darius had been building, and the longer he looked, the colder he felt. He was a retired high school math teacher. He understood patterns. He understood the difference between a player who was winning by accident and a player who was winning by design, and what he saw on that board was designed so clean and so deep that it made his own moves look like guesses, which was exactly what they had been. He took out his phone and he searched for Darius Cole. The results came back in under 4 seconds. Gerald read for a long time. Then he closed his phone and sat very still, the way a man sits when he realizes he has just witnessed something he cannot unknow. He did not say anything to Randall that afternoon. He went home and he thought about what he had read, and he made a decision that would take him 3 weeks to act on. But act on it he would. Because what Gerald Fitch had found on his phone in 4 seconds of searching was a name that appeared in tournament records, in rated game databases, in a brief profile published 6 months earlier in a Chess Federation newsletter. a name attached to a USCF rating of 2204, a rating that placed its holder in the top fraction of 1% of junior players in the United States, a rating that had a formal classification attached to it. National Master Darius Cole, age 14, was a National Master of Chess, and Randall Pruitt had told him to go home. Gerald set his phone on his kitchen table and looked at it for a moment longer. Then he picked up a pen and a notepad and began to write down everything he had seen that afternoon, what was said, who was present, the exact words, the exact sequence. He wrote it in the careful, orderly hand of a man who had spent 30 years grading papers and knew the difference between an account that would hold and one that would not. He dated it at the top. He signed it at the bottom. He was not sure yet what he would do with it. But he understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent a lifetime watching young people be told they don't belong in rooms they were built for, that doing nothing was no longer an option he could live with. 3 weeks later, he would make a phone call. That call would set in motion something that Randall Pruitt, standing in his linen shirt at the center of his pavilion, had never once considered possible. The board had been speaking all along. He simply hadn't known how to listen. 3 weeks after Gerald Fitch signed his name at the bottom of that notepad page, he made the phone call he had been rehearsing in his head every morning over coffee. He did not call Randall Pruitt. He did not call the Park District's general line. He called the Chicago Park District's Office of Equity and Inclusion, and he asked to speak with someone in a supervisory capacity. And when a woman named Director Anita Reyes came on the line, Gerald read from his notes in the careful, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 30 years teaching young people that precision matters. He read every word he had written, the date, the time, the exact language Randall had used, the names of the people who had been present, the position on the board, and then, at the end, he said one more thing. He said, "The boy he told to leave is a USCF National Master. He is 14 years old, and he was removed from a public park pavilion for no reason that I can account for except the one I am not willing to say out loud." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Director Reyes said, "Can you send me what you have in writing?" Gerald said he already had it ready. He had been ready for 3 weeks. Now, here's what most people did not know about what happened in the weeks that followed. Director Reyes did not move slowly. She was a compact, deliberate woman who had spent 19 years working in city government and had developed, through that time, a precise sensitivity to the difference between a complaint that would dissolve under scrutiny and one that would harden. Gerald's account hardened. She pulled the Park District's records on the Hargrove Park Chess Association. She found the membership roster. She found the fee structure. She found the orientation requirement. She found the application process, which was nowhere posted publicly, which had no formal criteria, and which, in 11 years of operation, had produced a membership that was 91% white in a neighborhood whose surrounding census tracts were 63% Black and Latino. She noted this. She did not call Randall Pruitt yet. She called the Park District's legal counsel first. Then she called the Illinois Human Rights Commission. Then she called a contact she had at the Chicago Tribune, not to leak anything, but to understand the shape of what might become public and when. She was building something, methodically, in silence, the way certain people build things when they have learned that speed without structure is just noise. Meanwhile, Darius Cole had gone back to his grandfather's apartment on the Saturday after he was told to leave the pavilion, and he had sat down at the kitchen table, and he had opened his composition notebook, and he had continued studying. He did not tell his grandfather what had happened at the park, not that day. He sat with the board between them that evening and played 3 games against Walter, and Walter won one of them, which was not common anymore, and which Darius allowed to happen in the way that a person allows something not because they cannot prevent it, but because they understand that the other person's dignity is worth more than their own demonstration. Walter noticed. Walter always noticed. "Something on your mind," Walter said. It was not a question. Darius moved a bishop. "I got told to leave a place today." Walter was quiet for a moment. He studied the board. Then he said, "Did you leave?" "Yes." Walter nodded once. "Good," he said. "That's the right answer. You don't fight for a seat at a table that doesn't want you. You build a better table." Darius looked up from the board. Walter was already looking at him, and in the old man's eyes was something that had no name in any language Darius had learned yet. A kind of grief that had been metabolized so completely over so many decades that it had become, on the other side of the process, something very close to peace. "Stay low," Walter said. "Build high," Darius said. They played until the apartment went dark. What Darius did not tell his grandfather, what he did not tell anyone, was that he had already been in contact for the past 2 months with a program coordinator at the Illinois Chess Federation named Marcus Webb. Marcus was 34 years old, a former collegiate player who had grown up on the South Side and who had spent the last 6 years running a scholastic outreach program designed to identify and develop high-rated junior players from underserved communities. He had found Darius's name in the USCF database 8 months earlier. He had sent an email. Darius had replied. They had been corresponding since. Marcus had been trying to get Darius into a specific event. The Illinois State Scholastic Open was held every January at a hotel in downtown Chicago. It was not a junior tournament. It was an open-rated event that drew the strongest players in the state, scholastic and adult alike, and it was the event at which the state's current scholastic champion, a 17-year-old named Ethan Voss, rated 2387, the highest-rated junior player in Illinois history, was expected to defend his title. Ethan had won the State Scholastic Open 3 years running. He was already being recruited by universities. He had been profiled in Chess Life magazine. He was, by any honest measure, the best young chess player the state of Illinois had produced in a generation. Marcus Webb believed Darius could beat him. He had believed it for 4 months. He had watched Darius's rated games, tracked his preparation, seen the way his opening repertoire had deepened, and his endgame technique had sharpened into something that was no longer the work of a prodigy, but the work of a craftsman. He had submitted Darius's registration for the Illinois State Scholastic Open on the first day registration opened. Darius had not told his grandfather about this either. He had not told anyone. He simply kept studying. Every morning before his mother left for work. Every night with the flashlight. The openings, the middle games, the end games. The annotated games of players he admired and players he did not. The positions that had no clean solution. The positions that only revealed their logic after you had sat with them long enough to stop looking for the obvious answer. He moved in silence. He built in silence, and the board, as his grandfather had promised him 8 years ago on a flattened grocery bag on the floor of their apartment, was waiting for its moment to speak. The Illinois State Scholastic Open was held on a Saturday in the 3rd week of January, in a ballroom on the 2nd floor of the Marquette Hotel in the Loop. The room smelled of carpet cleaner and the particular dry warmth of forced hotel air, and by 9 o'clock in the morning it held 47 players, 6 tournament directors, a handful of parents seated along the walls, and Marcus Webb, who had arrived 40 minutes early and was standing near the registration table with a cup of coffee he had not yet touched. Darius arrived with his canvas bag over one shoulder and his composition notebook under his arm. He was wearing a navy sweater his mother had bought him for the occasion, and his grandfather's chess set was in the bag, the mismatched pieces, the black queen slightly too tall, the white king-side rook with the chip along its base. He had been asked, once, by a tournament director at a previous event, whether he wanted to use the house pieces instead. He had said no. He always said no. He registered. He found his seat assignment. He sat down. He did not look around the room. Across the ballroom, Ethan Voss was seated at the top board with the settled posture of someone who had been in this room before and expected to leave it the same way he always had. He was tall, composed, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from a long and largely unbroken record of being right. He had reviewed his preparation the night before. He had slept well. He had eaten breakfast. He was ready. He did not know Darius Cole's name. He would by the end of the day. The tournament ran 6 rounds. Darius won the first 4 without losing a piece in the final position of any game. He won the 5th in 23 moves against a Class A player who had been competing in state events for 6 years and who sat for a long moment after the game was over, looking at the board before extending his hand. The 6th round, the final round, paired Darius against Ethan Voss. The room knew it before the pairings were posted. There was a shift in the air, a reorientation of attention, the way a crowd moves when something is about to happen that it does not yet have language for. Marcus Webb set down his coffee cup. It was still full. Darius sat across from Ethan Voss and set up his grandfather's pieces with the same deliberate care he always used. The pawns first, the minor pieces, the rooks, the queen, the king. He placed the white king-side rook, the one with the chip along its base, in its square and did not adjust it. Ethan looked at the mismatched set for a moment. He said nothing. The clock was set. The game began. What happened in the next 94 minutes was something that the 6 tournament directors and 45 other players and the parents seated along the walls and Marcus Webb standing near the door would describe, in the days and weeks that followed, in language that kept reaching for metaphor because the plain facts were almost too simple to carry the weight of what they had witnessed. Darius Cole played the entire game without once looking at the board. Not in a performative way, not as a statement. He simply looked, after the first 12 moves, at a point slightly above and to the left of the board, at the middle distance, at nothing in particular, and he played from there. His hand reached down and moved a piece with the unhurried certainty of a man returning a book to a shelf he has memorized. Then he folded his hands in his lap and looked at the middle distance again. Ethan Voss noticed after the 14th move. His composure shifted by a fraction, not enough for most people to see, but enough for Marcus Webb, who was watching from across the room to see it clearly. Ethan leaned forward. He studied the board. He played his move. He looked up at Darius. Darius was looking at the middle distance. By move 22, 2 of the tournament directors had drifted toward the top board. By move 28, every player in the room who had finished their own game had gathered at a respectful distance, standing in a loose semicircle, watching in the particular silence of people who understand what they are seeing and do not want to disturb it. Ethan Voss was one of the finest junior players in the country. He fought. He found the best moves available to him, move after move, with the focused precision of someone who has trained for exactly this kind of pressure. He was not outplayed carelessly. He was outplayed completely by a 14-year-old who was not looking at the board, who had mapped the entire game in his head before it began, who had understood the critical junction at move 31 before the pieces were even set up. On move 37, Ethan Voss extended his hand. He said, "Good game." Darius looked at the board for the first time in 25 moves. He looked at it the way you look at something you already knew was there. Then he looked at Ethan's extended hand and he shook it. He said, "Thank you." 2 words, quiet, without theater. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. What moved through it was something more considered than applause, a kind of collective recalibration, the sound of 47 people adjusting their understanding of what was possible. One of the tournament directors, a woman named Carol Hines, who had been running state events for 22 years, stood with her arms folded and her eyes slightly bright and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, the room followed her. Marcus Webb did not clap. He stood near the door with his hands in his coat pockets and his untouched coffee on the table beside him, and he looked at Darius Cole across the ballroom, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. The particular, bone-deep satisfaction of having been exactly right about something that mattered. Darius began, quietly and without hurry, to collect his grandfather's pieces. The pawns first, the minor pieces, the rooks, the queen, the king. He placed the white king-side rook, the chip along its base, into the canvas bag last, the way he always did. He zipped the bag. He stood. And somewhere across the city, in a park pavilion, where 8 chess tables were bolted to the ground in 2 neat rows, Randall Pruitt had no idea that the board had just spoken. He was about to find out. The reckoning did not arrive with noise. It arrived the way certain things arrive when they have been built carefully and in silence, quietly, completely, and without the possibility of reversal. Director Anita Reyes had spent 3 weeks assembling what she would later describe to her supervisor as one of the cleaner cases she had encountered in 19 years of city work. She had the membership records. She had the fee structure. She had the orientation requirement that existed nowhere in the Park District's public documentation and had never been submitted for review. She had Gerald Fitch's signed and dated account, written in the careful hand of a retired teacher who understood that precision was the difference between a record that held and one that dissolved. She had the demographic data, 11 years of membership, 91% white, in a park whose surrounding neighborhood was 63% Black and Latino. She had, from the Park District's own archives, 3 separate written complaints from the previous 4 years, each filed by Black residents who had been turned away from the pavilion, each marked as resolved, none of which had resulted in any documented action. She had a pattern. Patterns in city government were the only thing that moved institutions. She called Randall Pruitt on a Tuesday morning in February, 4 weeks after Gerald Fitch's phone call and 3 weeks after Darius Cole had won the Illinois State Scholastic Open. She did not tell Randall what she had. She told him only that the Chicago Park District's Office of Equity and Inclusion was conducting a review of the Hargrove Park Chess Association's operating practices, and that she would need him to come in for a meeting at the end of the week. Randall said he was happy to come in. He said it with the confidence of a man who has never been in a room where he was not the most certain person present. He had no idea what was waiting for him in that room. Now, here's what most people did not know about what happened in that meeting. Randall arrived in his linen shirt. He arrived with a folder of his own. The association's bylaws, the membership application, the orientation materials. He arrived with the bearing of a man prepared to explain himself and to be thanked for the explanation. He sat down across from Director Reyes, and he began, before she had said a single word, to describe the association's history and its standards and its commitment to the game. Director Reyes let him talk for 4 minutes. Then she set a document on the table between them. It was Gerald Fitch's account, every word of it, the date, the time, the exact language, the names of the witnesses, the position on the board, and at the bottom, in Gerald's careful hand, the information he had found in 4 seconds of searching, the name, the rating, the classification. National Master, age 14. Randall looked at the document. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not yet, but the first crack in the certainty, the first fracture in the expression of a man who has never once been told he was wrong about anything that mattered to him. "This is one person's account," Randall said. Director Reyes placed a second document on the table. The demographic records, 11 years, 91%. "This is 11 years of yours," she said. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Director Reyes informed Randall Pruitt that the Hargrove Park Chess Association's operating agreement with the Chicago Park District was being suspended pending a full review by the Office of Equity and Inclusion in coordination with the Illinois Human Rights Commission. The association would not hold events at the pavilion during the review period. The membership fee structure and application process would be subject to formal audit. The 3 prior complaints would be reopened. Randall said he intended to contest this. Director Reyes said he was welcome to. He did contest it. He hired a lawyer. He wrote letters. He called the alderman whose framed photograph hung on the wall of his home office, and the alderman, who had his own calculations to make in an election year, did not return the call. The review proceeded. The Illinois Human Rights Commission's investigation, which had been opened quietly 3 weeks earlier on the basis of the same pattern Director Reyes had identified, widened to include testimony from the 3 residents who had filed the prior complaints. One of them, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been turned away from the pavilion in 2021 while her son, watched, agreed to be interviewed. Her account was documented. It was consistent with Gerald Fitch's. It was consistent with the records. The Commission's findings, released 6 weeks later, were unambiguous. The Hargrove Park Chess Association had operated, for a period of not less than 8 years, in a manner that constituted a pattern of racially discriminatory exclusion from a public facility. The operating agreement with the Park District was terminated. The association, as it had existed under Randall Pruitt's leadership, was dissolved. The Park District was directed to develop a new, open enrollment chess program at Hargrove Park. No fees, no sponsorship requirement, no orientation, no application, and to post the program's availability in English, Spanish, and Polish in the surrounding neighborhood. Randall Pruitt was removed as the association's president. He was not arrested. He was not fined. He was simply removed, stripped of the 11 years of administration he had mistaken for mastery, stripped of the room he had thought he owned, stripped of the authority he had used to tell a 14-year-old boy to go home. The gold watch was still on his wrist. The linen shirt was still pressed, but the pavilion was no longer his, and it would never be his again. That was the reckoning, not with anger, not with revenge, with records and patterns and a retired math teacher who had taken out a pen and a notepad and written down everything he had seen. Gerald Fitch received a letter from Director Reyes's office 3 months after the commission's findings were released. It was a formal acknowledgment of his role in the investigation, and it was accompanied by a note she had written herself in her own hand, thanking him for the precision of his account and for the courage, as she put it, of a man who could have looked away and chose not to. Gerald read the letter at his kitchen table. He folded it carefully. He put it in the same drawer where he kept the notepad, which he had not thrown away. He also, in the weeks that followed, became one of the first adult volunteers for the new open enrollment chess program at Hargrove Park. He was there on the first Saturday it operated, the same pavilion, the same 8 tables bolted to the ground in 2 neat rows, the same afternoon light, and he set up a board at table 7 and waited to see who would sit across from him. Marcus Webb received something different. The Illinois Chess Federation, responding to the attention that Darius Cole's tournament win had generated in the chess community, approved a significant expansion of Marcus's scholastic outreach program. 3 new partner schools on the south and west sides, a dedicated coaching stipend, and a small travel fund for junior players who qualified for national events. Marcus had been asking for that expansion for 4 years. He had been told each time that the budget did not support it. After the story of what had happened at Hargrove Park became public, and it did become public, first in a brief item in the Tribune, then in a longer piece in a Chess Federation newsletter, then in a story that spread in the particular way stories spread when they carry the weight of something people already knew but had not yet seen named. The budget somehow supported it. Darius Cole did not attend the commission hearing. He did not speak to the Tribune. He did not post anything. He did not, as far as anyone could document, say a single public word about Randall Pruitt or the pavilion or what had happened on that Saturday afternoon in October. He went home. He sat at the kitchen table with his grandfather, and he told Walter, finally, everything. The pavilion, the 2 words, the walk home, the tournament, the game, the 94 minutes, the moment Ethan Voss extended his hand. Walter listened without interrupting. He listened the way he had always listened, with the full economy of a man who understood that some things deserved to be received in silence. When Darius finished, Walter reached across the table and placed his hand on his grandson's hand. He held it there for a moment. Then he said simply, "The board spoke." Darius looked at his grandfather. Walter's eyes were bright, the way the eyes of old men sometimes go bright when they have lived long enough to see the things they planted begin to flower. "It spoke," Darius said. They played that evening until the apartment went dark. The mismatched pieces moved across the board between them. The black queen, slightly too tall, the white king-side rook with the chip along its base, and the radiator knocked in the wall, and somewhere below them the hallway smelled of someone else's cooking, and everything was exactly as it had always been, which was in the end the point. Now, I want to say something before we close. What happened to Darius Cole in that park pavilion happens every day. Not always at a chess table, not always with those exact 2 words, but the shape of it. A black child, a public space, a man with a gold watch and 11 years of certainty, 2 words delivered without looking up. That shape is not rare. It is not exceptional. It is for too many people simply Tuesday. What is rare is what Darius did with it. He did not argue. He did not perform his credentials. He did not explain himself to a man who had already decided not to hear him. He picked up his pieces, one by one, with the same care he always used, and he walked out into the afternoon light, and he went home, and he kept building. Stay low, build high. The board will speak for itself when it's time. His grandfather gave him those words when he was 6 years old, sitting on the floor with a flattened grocery bag between them. He carried them for 8 years. He carried them into a hotel ballroom in January, and he sat across from the best junior player in the state of Illinois, and without once looking at the board, he let the board speak. The question I keep returning to is this: how many Darius Coles have we told to go home? How many people have we assessed in a single glance, in a worn jacket, at the wrong table, in the wrong neighborhood, and dismissed before we ever asked a single question? And how many of them walked away in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned from someone wiser than us that the board speaks for itself? Dignity does not require an audience. Restraint is not the same as surrender. And the people the world overlooks are not waiting for our permission to be extraordinary. They never were. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever carried something quietly that the world didn't bother to ask about, drop a comment and tell me what it was. I want to hear it. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, share this one and subscribe. Every week we find the people the world overlooked and we tell their stories. Because memory is evidence, and silence, when it is chosen and not imposed, can be the loudest thing in the room.